Between 1969 and 1978, in the quiet fields and farming towns of Cumberland County, North Carolina, 6 people died in ways that seemed almost identical. It always began the same way: sudden stomach pain, so sharp it doubled them over waves of unstoppable vomiting, and finally, an agonizing decline that ended in death within just a few days. And yet, no one was suspicious. Because each of these tragedies had something in common: one gentle church-going grandmother who was always close by. Her name was Velma Barfield. She brought food when neighbors fell ill, prayed softly at bedsides, and offered comfort in moments of despair. To her small community, she was a blessing. But blessings can hide darker truths. Doctors called the deaths heart failure, or gastroenteritis, or just misfortune. After all, in rural North Carolina, sickness was not unusual. And who could imagine that the kindly grandmother holding your hand might be the reason you were dying? Everything might have remained buried until 1978. At a Pentecostal revival, Stuart Taylor, a 56-year-old man who had been courting Velma, suddenly collapsed. This time, his family refused to accept the familiar explanation of just another tragic death. They demanded an autopsy. What they uncovered would shock not only Cumberland County, but the entire nation. Velma Barfield, the soft-spoken grandmother, was revealed as one of America's most cunning serial killers, and she would go on to become the first woman in US history executed by lethal injection. Before we go further into this chilling story of how caregiving became killing, let me pause for a moment. If you enjoy uncovering dark corners of history, make sure you're subscribed to Sleepy History Tales and let me know in the comments where are you listening from tonight. Because the unsettling truth is, a story like this could have happened anywhere. Investigators would later discover that Velma had not used rare poisons or exotic methods. No, she chose something far more ordinary, hiding in plain sight. Common rat poison slipped with careful precision. She had turned something meant for pests into a deadly tool of control murder as an art form. To understand how Velma's mask of innocence held for so long, we need to step back. North Carolina in the 1960s and 70s was a place where trust and faith bound communities together. Church attendance wasn't just expected, it was the center of life. Neighbors helped neighbors, doors were left unlocked, and a grandmother's presence was considered the safest comfort of all. In Parkton, a tiny town of fewer than 500 people, the rhythms of life were simple red clay fields stretching to the horizon, children playing in the streets, modest farmhouses tucked among cotton and tobacco rows, and the Baptist church serving as both spiritual guide and social gathering hall. A person's word was their bond, and reputation meant everything. Into this deeply traditional, trusting world, Velma Barfield had been born originally Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932. She was the second child and eldest daughter in a family of 9 siblings. Raised near Fayetteville, her early life was shaped by both hardship and faith. The Bullards worked a small farm growing tobacco and cotton. Life was harsh, but it carried its own dignity. The family lived without electricity or running water like many neighbors at the time. Indoor plumbing was a luxury reserved for city folk. When nature called, the children simply walked to the woods behind their home. Poverty was not shameful here, it was simply life. What bound the Bullard family together was their strict Pentecostal faith, church every Sunday, daily prayers, a constant reminder of moral absolutes, and the belief that God's eyes watched over everything. Within this setting, Velma grew up quiet, obedient, and clever. At school, she quickly proved herself. Teachers praised her for her intelligence and kindness. She excelled in reading and writing, and though her family had little money, her grades suggested she had the potential to achieve something greater. She was the student who helped others with lessons, who never caused trouble, and who seemed destined to rise above the limits of her upbringing. And then came her teenage years at Parkton Public School, where Velma discovered something that surprised even her, a passion for basketball. Though Velma never had the tall, lean build of a natural athlete, she possessed something far more valuable on the basketball court. Quick reflexes, sharp instincts, and an almost uncanny sense for the rhythm of the game. For a time, basketball was her escape, a weekly reprieve from chores, childcare, and the never-ending demands of farm life. But freedom rarely lasted long in the Bullard household. When her mother Lily gave birth to twins, Velma's role as eldest daughter shifted overnight. Her hands were needed at home. Her days of running the court ended abruptly as she was pressed into cooking, cleaning, and caring for her younger siblings. For Velma, the loss was devastating. Basketball had been her first taste of independence, and it was taken from her before it had even fully begun. It was during this season of frustration and longing that Velma met Thomas Burke. He was tall and awkward, with dark hair, prominent ears, and a crooked smile that wasn't conventionally handsome, but his humor and kindness made him magnetic. Unlike Velma's stern father, Thomas treated her gently, listening to her frustrations and making her laugh when she felt trapped at home. Their courtship was innocent stolen between school hallways and fleeting conversations after church services. But Velma's father's rules about dating were ironclad. Even when she turned 16, the age he had always declared old enough, he suddenly changed the rules again, declaring it too young for serious romance. The restriction only fueled their determination. Their secret meetings grew bolder, their connection deeper. And by 17, Velma saw no other path forward. Marriage in her eyes was not just about love. It was her escape route, her chance to step into a life that was finally her own. So, on a quiet morning in 1949, Velma and Thomas drove to a justice of the peace in a neighboring county and married in a simple ceremony. No elaborate dress, no music, just vows exchanged binding two teenagers together for what would become 20 turbulent years. The young couple settled into a small family home in Parkton, modest but full of promise. For the first time, Velma had a household of her own to shape decisions to make without her father's control and a future to imagine with Thomas. Their early years brimmed with hope. They dreamed of building the kind of steady, loving family that had always felt just out of reach in their own childhoods. But those dreams began to wither in 1965 when tragedy struck. Thomas was commuting home from the textile mill where he worked, driving along a rain-slicked country road when his car lost control. The crash left him with a severe concussion and lingering injuries that would haunt the rest of his life. At first, recovery seemed possible. He returned to work within weeks, determined not to let pain stop him from providing for his family. But the headaches never went away. They grew sharper, more frequent until they left him curled in agony for hours, sometimes days. Dizziness followed, then absences from work. Eventually, the mill dismissed him. with no steady paycheck, rising medical bills, and no access to real pain management. The Burke's finances began collapsing, and Thomas, like many men of his time, turned to the only cheap medicine within reach: alcohol. What started as an occasional beer became a dependency. Beer turned to liquor. Liquor turned to a near constant fog of drinking. For Velma, raised in a household where Pentecostal preachers had thundered that alcohol was one of the gravest sins, Thomas's drinking was more than weakness. It was betrayal, both moral and spiritual. Her reaction was not sympathy, but control. She searched the house for bottles, poured liquor down the sink, enlisted the children to report on their father's drinking. What began as concern soon became obsession. The Burke household, once full of tender dreams and simple hopes, slowly transformed into a battleground. Resentment smoldered like embers under the surface. Every conversation risked flaring into argument. Thomas, already humiliated by his injuries and his inability to work, saw Velma's constant monitoring of his drinking not as care, but as betrayal. And Velma, who once looked at Thomas as her gentle escape from a harsh childhood, now saw only a stranger, bitter, volatile, and frighteningly unpredictable. The breaking point came when Velma made a decision that would forever fracture what little trust remained. She had Thomas committed to Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh for alcoholism treatment without his consent. To Thomas, it was the ultimate betrayal, his wife siding with authorities, locking him away under the label of an alcoholic. The treatment worked in a sense. Thomas emerged sober. But sobriety had not restored the man Velma once knew. He came home resentful, hollowed out, and emotionally distant. The easy laughter was gone. The warmth replaced with cold bitterness, and whatever fragile bond they once had was gone for good. While Thomas was away, Velma had been forced to shoulder the burden alone. She worked grueling shifts at a local mill to keep the family afloat. The exhaustion, physical, emotional, spiritual, drove her to lean on something new: prescription pills. At first, just Valium offered by a sympathetic family doctor to help her sleep. But soon her tolerance built. More pills from more sources became part of her daily survival. By the late 1960s, the Burke household no longer resembled a home. It was a Cold War waged in silence, punctuated by sharp arguments over money. The children and Thomas's inability to keep steady work. And then came the night of April 4th, 1969. That evening, Thomas had been drinking again. Not enough to be senseless, but enough to leave him sluggish and dulled. Velma announced strangely that she needed to run errands late at night with both children in tow. It was unusual. Velma rarely left after dark, and neighbors would later remember how unsettled, even distracted, she had seemed in the days leading up to that night, as if struggling with a decision too heavy to speak aloud. Hours later, the Burke family returned to find their world engulfed in flames. The house was already collapsing under the fire's hunger. Velma screamed, tried to rush inside, and had to be held back as firefighters battled a blaze too advanced to save. When the flames subsided, the truth lay waiting in ash. Thomas Burke's body was discovered in the bedroom where the fire had started. The medical examiner's verdict: death by smoke inhalation. A small mercy that he had passed before the fire consumed him. Investigators with only limited training in fire forensics made a simple conclusion. Thomas had fallen asleep with a cigarette still burning. A common tragic accident in rural North Carolina homes. To everyone watching, Velma's grief was raw and undeniable. She sobbed uncontrollably, clawed toward the ruins of the house as neighbors restrained her. Her heartbreak was so visible, so convincing, that no one dared to question it. Instead, the community gathered around her. A widow, a mother. Broken but strong, no one could imagine that beneath those tears might have been something else. The funeral of Thomas Burke drew nearly the entire town into the pews of Parkton Baptist Church. Neighbors filled the aisles whispering condolences, offering prayers, watching the widow at the front with sympathetic eyes. And Velma played her role flawlessly. She wept with dignity. She spoke movingly about Thomas's long battle with pain and alcohol. She thanked the congregation for standing beside her in her family's darkest hour. To those gathered, she was the picture of grace in grief. A wife broken by tragedy, but upheld by faith. And yet, there were details. Small, unsettling details. Some neighbors remembered how Velma had quietly carried family photographs, important documents, and bits of jewelry out of the house in the days before the fire. She said they needed cleaning or safekeeping. Others recalled how unusual it was for her to leave home with the children late that night, leaving Thomas alone in his drunken haze. It felt oddly convenient. 3 months later, when the ashes of the Burke home had long cooled flames returned once more. Debris left on the vacant lot somehow ignited again, causing a second fire. This time, the blaze wasn't devastating, but it was suspicious enough to spark an insurance investigation. Velma, the grieving widow, emerged not ruined by misfortune, but quietly enriched. Between a modest life insurance payout community, donations from her church, and the settlement from the fire, she suddenly held more financial security than she had ever known. For a woman who had been teetering on the edge of poverty, widowhood had proven remarkably profitable, and in that profit, Velma discovered something. A chilling truth. That death, when orchestrated with care and explained with convincing tears, could solve problems while earning sympathy and reward. The grandmotherly figure had tasted blood, and her appetite was only beginning. In the months after Thomas's death, Velma revealed a side of herself that few could have imagined. Outwardly, she wore the mask of a faithful widow devoted to her children. But privately, she displayed an uncanny ability to attract and manipulate men who could offer her the stability she craved. Within just 6 months, her attention fixed on Jennings Barfield, a 43-year-old widower, known across Cumberland County as a man of respect and integrity. Jennings owned farmland, ran successful business ventures, and carried a reputation for decency. He had raised children on his own after his wife's death and was considered one of the county's most eligible bachelors. Velma's pursuit of him was deliberate, almost predatory. She appeared at social events where she knew he would be. She arrived at his property with thoughtful gifts or offers to help with small tasks. Slowly, she wove herself into his routine until Jennings could hardly imagine his days without her. To Jennings, she seemed like a gift from Providence. She was a skilled cook, a careful housekeeper, a woman of faith who attended church faithfully and participated in charitable works. She appeared to embody stability, warmth, and moral grounding. And so in August 1970, only 16 months after Thomas Burke's death, Velma walked down the aisle again. Their ceremony, though modest by most standards, was more elaborate than her first marriage. Children from both families stood as witnesses. The community, ever supportive, smiled on the match. They saw it as practical, sensible. A grieving widow finding security for her children, and a lonely widower finding companionship at last. What no one saw, what no one could imagine, was that the pattern had already begun. At first glance, the marriage of Velma and Jennings Barfield seemed almost charmed. Velma devoted herself to her new role with astonishing energy. Meals were on the table before Jennings could even feel hungry. The house ran with clockwork precision. She even offered to take over his bookkeeping, sparing him from the tedious details of business letters and account ledgers. To neighbors, it looked like domestic bliss. Jennings had found a loving, faithful wife. Velma, a secure home for her children. But beneath the polished veneer, old habits, dangerous habits, were growing roots. Velma's dependence on prescription drugs, which had begun years earlier, only deepened. By now, she was juggling a potent cocktail antidepressants, tranquilizers for anxiety, painkillers, Valium to sleep. Each prescription came from a different doctor in a different county. None saw the full picture. None realized just how dependent she had become. Maintaining that habit was expensive, far beyond what a modest household allowance could cover. And so, Velma, the meticulous bookkeeper, began dipping her hands into Jennings's accounts. At first it was subtle. Small withdrawals, forged checks, written just under the thresholds that triggered bank verification. She spread the theft across different accounts, studied Jennings's signature until she could reproduce it flawlessly. And for months, Jennings never suspected a thing. When he did glance at his records, Velma was ready with tearful explanations about household bills, medical emergencies, or business expenses he might have forgotten. Her feigned distress had a way of ending questions before they turned into accusations. But in early 1971, the net began to tighten. Jennings's longtime banker, Harold Mitchell, noticed oddities in the accounts. Spending patterns that didn't fit the careful conservative habits Jennings had kept for years. Mitchell quietly raised the matter, and soon Jennings himself began to see the truth. The confrontation was volcanic. Unlike Thomas Burke, Jennings was not weakened by alcohol or injury. He was strong, clear-eyed, and furious. He demanded answers. He threatened law enforcement. He told Velma he was seeking an attorney planning for divorce. For Velma, that word divorce was more than a threat. It was annihilation, exposure of her crimes, possible prison for forgery and theft. The loss of financial security she had clawed so desperately to obtain. But Velma had learned something from her first husband's death. A lesson she would never unlearn. Permanent solutions were often easier than temporary compromises. On the night of March 22, 1971, Jennings Barfield suddenly doubled over with stomach pain. At first he thought it was indigestion, but the cramping grew worse, stabbing his upper abdomen with merciless precision. Nausea, vomiting, then crushing chest pain. Velma, ever the picture of a concerned wife, called their doctor. She helped Jennings to the hospital, hovering by his bedside. Doctors were baffled. Tests suggested infection, but nothing explained the ferocity of his symptoms. His blood pressure plummeted. His chest pain intensified. At 3:17 a.m., March 23rd, Jennings Barfield died. The cause was listed as acute heart failure, likely brought on by a sudden gastric infection. Velma's grief was spectacular. She wailed. She collapsed. She required sedation at the hospital. Family members had to step in just to handle the funeral arrangements. The community saw a widow struck by tragedy for the second time in just 2 years. But what they could not see was that this tragedy was no accident. It was the perfect crime, wrapped in the disguise of perfect grief. The funeral of Jennings Barfield was a well-attended affair. Business associates, neighbors, and fellow church members gathered to mourn a man who had been respected across the county. Their deepest sympathies poured out to Velma, a woman who in less than 2 years had lost not one but 2 husbands. The timing of Jennings's death made it all the more tragic. He had been planning to expand his farming operations, securing new policies of life insurance to safeguard his ventures. Those policies, combined with his existing coverage and property, meant that his sudden passing left Velma far wealthier than she had ever been. Within weeks, she moved with astonishing efficiency. Jennings's estate was settled, insurance payouts collected, plans for the future quietly set in motion. Velma purchased a modest home near her parents in Fayetteville, enrolled her children in new schools, and told friends it was all about needing family support during grief. But behind the mask of widowhood, something darker had taken shape. Unlike her first husband's fiery death, Jennings's murder required no spectacle. No staged accident, no smoldering debris. Just carefully measured doses of arsenic-based rat poison, administered with precision. The symptoms, sudden gastric distress followed by heart failure, were textbook enough to fool even seasoned doctors. And this time, Velma had perfected her timing. Jennings had discovered her thefts and was threatening divorce. In a matter of days, he might have changed his will or gone to the police. Velma acted swiftly, ensuring that his voice was silenced before it could undo her plans. She was no longer just an opportunist stumbling upon murder as a solution. She was something new, something far more chilling. A calculated predator who understood the lethal balance of timing, motive, and disguise. And she was just getting started. Her move back to Fayetteville seemed innocent enough, living close to her aging parents, a daughter showing devotion in their twilight years. Her father, Murphy Bullard, was already gravely ill with lung cancer. His death came naturally, one of the rare times Velma didn't need to intervene. But her mother, Lillian Bullard, was another matter. At 74, Lillian was financially stable, living on a modest pension, careful savings, and several insurance policies tucked away. She was also becoming increasingly dependent on Velma for daily help managing bills, balancing her checkbook, handling correspondence. To friends, it looked like a doting daughter caring for her frail mother. To Lillian, it was a relief to have help with confusing paperwork. But to Velma, it was an opportunity. She studied her mother's signatures, memorized account numbers, learned the rhythm of transactions, and then quietly, the theft began. At first, it was pocket money, $20 here, $30 there, small enough to escape notice, explained away as groceries or medicine. But addiction is a hungry beast. Velma's dependence on pills grew, and so did the amounts she siphoned. By the summer of 1974, she was draining hundreds of dollars each month from her mother's accounts. She had even discovered that Lillian held valuable savings bonds and multiple insurance policies assets, Velma now eyed as if they were pieces on her own private chessboard. The mask of a caring daughter was firmly in place. But behind it, Velma was rehearsing her next act. And this time, the stage would be her own family home. For Velma, temptation was everywhere. Her mother's modest savings insurance bonds and pensions sat just within reach, untouchable in large amounts, but always whispering promises of what they could provide. Taking too much would be noticed. Taking too little only delayed the inevitable. And so Velma devised a chilling solution. That winter, Lillian Bullard began suffering from sudden mysterious illnesses, violent cramping waves of nausea, and days of relentless diarrhea that would just as suddenly vanish. Each time, Velma was at her side spooning broth, dabbing her forehead, whispering comfort. To neighbors, it looked like a devoted daughter's care. But in truth, these episodes were experiments, carefully measured doses of arsenic, trials in timing, studies in suffering. Velma had learned from Jennings's death that arsenic poisoning could mimic natural illness, but now she was refining her technique. How much would cause pain without death? How long would symptoms linger before fading? Each attack left Lillian weaker, more fragile, and most importantly, more dependent on her daughter. Gratitude replaced suspicion. Fear of another episode kept her from questioning Velma's suggestions about money or household matters. Slowly, Velma's control became absolute. But while she rehearsed with her mother, her personal life took another dark turn. In 1974, Velma began dating Robert Mackenzie, a widowed local businessman. Robert saw her as a devoted mother and caring daughter, qualities that charmed him especially after his own loss. Their relationship deepened quickly. Marriage was soon on the horizon, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. On August night, Robert died in a single-car accident on a rural highway. The road was clear. The night was calm. Robert had always been a cautious driver. Yet somehow his vehicle left the road and slammed into a tree at high speed. No mechanical failure was found. No toxicology tests were performed. His death was written off as an accident. But to Velma, it was convenient. Robert had begun to ask questions about her finances, about her family, that hinted at suspicions he couldn't quite voice. Questions that, had he lived, might have pulled the mask away. By Christmas of that same year, Velma faced a new crisis. Bank audits and insurance reviews loomed. The amounts she had siphoned from her mother's accounts were now too large to hide. Exposure was inevitable unless Velma acted. And so during what should have been a joyful holiday gathering, Lillian was struck down by her most devastating illness yet. The cramps were unending. The vomiting was violent. Dehydration set in, swiftly leaving her delirious and gasping. Velma played the part, flawlessly rushing her mother to the hospital, clutching her hand, weeping at the bedside as doctors scrambled. Dr. Stevenson, her longtime physician, was called in. He was as puzzled as ever. Test results showed abnormalities, but nothing that pointed to a clear cause. 2 days later, on December 30th, 1974, at 11:43 p.m., Velma's mother took her final breath. The official cause: complications from acute gastroenteritis. But behind the mask of grief, Velma knew the truth. Her experiments were complete. Her method was perfected, and her own mother had been the proof. At the hospital, Lillian's death was recorded as nothing more than a tragic case of acute gastroenteritis. The attending physician admitted the symptoms were unusual, violent, fast-moving, and baffling, but in an aura when doctors really suspected deliberate poisoning. The possibility of foul play never even crossed his mind. To the outside world, Velma was the picture of devastation. She sobbed uncontrollably at her mother's bedside. She required sedation just to sleep. At the funeral, she clung to her role as the grieving daughter, surrounded by neighbors and church members who remembered Lillian as a devout Christian, a mother of 9, a woman of service. But behind that mask of grief, Velma was celebrating. Her mother's death erased months of thefts and forgery. No more questions about missing funds. No more risk of discovery. The estate settlement didn't just hand her money, it legitimized the money she had already stolen. And most chilling of all, Velma had gained something far more powerful than financial security confidence. She had killed her own mother with clinical precision. No suspicion, no whispers, not even the faintest shadow of doubt. And if she could get away with murdering the woman who had given her life, then who in the world could possibly be safe from her? By 1975, Velma's crimes became bolder, sloppier. Her check forging, once careful and calculated, turned reckless. She grew greedy, forging larger sums, targeting more people. Eventually, her arrogance caught up with her. Velma was arrested on 7 counts of writing bad checks. The investigation uncovered a trail of financial crimes stretching across multiple counties. Small businesses, friends, neighbors, people who had once trusted her. The shock in the community was palpable. They had seen her as a poor, unfortunate widow. Now she stood exposed as a deliberate thief. The judge sentenced her to 6 months in prison. For most, it would have been a turning point, a chance to confront addiction to start over. For Velma, it became something far more sinister, a classroom. Inside, she learned new tricks of the trade from other women. Fresh methods of forgery, identity theft, and manipulation. Her skill sharpened, her resolve hardened, and most dangerously, prison convinced her of something chilling. Stealing money was risky. Victims could talk, victims could fight back. But dead victims told no tales. Velma walked out after serving just 3 months, not broken, but emboldened. And almost immediately, she found her next opportunity. In 1976, Velma was hired as a home health aide for an elderly couple in Lumberton, North Carolina, Montgomery Edwards, age 94, and his wife Dolly, age 84. Wealthy enough to afford private care but isolated with few visitors and little oversight. To most, they looked like fragile souls in need of comfort and support. To Velma, they looked like the perfect prey. The Edwards family thought they had found a blessing. Velma came highly recommended, armed with glowing references and a reputation as a Christian woman devoted to caring for those in need. She attended church, faithfully asked for Wednesday nights and Sundays off for services, and spoke humbly of how economic hardship had forced her into caregiving. To Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, she seemed like an angel sent from heaven. But what they welcomed into their home was something far darker. The couple handed Velma their trust just as so many others had before. They gave her the keys to their home, their cars, even access to their financial records. Within weeks, Velma was studying their signatures, memorizing account numbers, and tracking their spending habits like a seasoned thief. By the time they realized anything was wrong, if they ever could, she had already forged checks and siphoned off large sums disguised neatly as ordinary expenses. Montgomery at 94 was too frail and confused to notice. Dolly at 84 had never handled the finances and didn't know what to look for. To them, Velma wasn't a predator, she was their lifeline, and they thanked her for it. On January 29, 1977, Montgomery passed away peacefully, his death attributed to the natural decline of age. The family grieved but took comfort in how gently Velma had cared for him. Grateful, they insisted she stay on to help Dolly adjust to widowhood. But barely a month later, the familiar pattern returned. On March 1st, Dolly Edwards, who had seemed steady and resilient, was suddenly struck down by violent cramps, nausea, and relentless diarrhea. The symptoms were eerily similar to those suffered by Velma's past victims. And as always, Velma was there, spooning broths, brewing teas, whispering prayers, and playing the role of the tireless, devoted caregiver. At the hospital, despite medical intervention, Dolly's condition worsened rapidly. By evening, she was gone. Velma was holding her hand, reciting prayers as the elderly woman took her last breath. The Edwards family, reeling from 2 deaths in just over a month, praised Velma as a godsend. At Dolly's funeral, they spoke of her selfless care, never suspecting the bitter truth. Dolly had begun asking questions about missing funds. And Velma, unwilling to risk exposure, silenced her forever, just as she had silenced her own mother. But Velma wasn't finished. Not even close. Almost immediately, she was reassigned to another elderly couple in need, John Henry Lee, age 80, and his wife, Ricord Lee, who was recovering from a broken leg. Another frail, trusting household. Another perfect hunting ground. The Lee family welcomed Velma with open arms, grateful for her reputation as a devoted Christian caregiver. After hearing glowing praise from the Edwards family, they believed they had found the perfect help during a vulnerable time. John Henry Lee, a proud retired farmer, had worked hard his entire life to build a secure retirement for himself and his wife Ricord. Independent by nature, he had initially resisted the idea of outside help. But with age catching up and his wife recovering from a broken leg, he reluctantly agreed. Velma quickly became indispensable. She organized their medications, prepared meals, handled small chores, and offered the comfort of constant companionship. But behind this facade of kindness, her familiar pattern had already begun. Velma quietly studied their finances, biding her time. John Henry, more attentive than some of her past victims, kept a close eye on his accounts. But even the sharpest watchfulness has its gaps. Patiently, Velma exploited moments of distraction, slipping in forged checks and small withdrawals disguised as routine household expenses. And then, the horror returned. On June 4th, 1977, John Henry Lee, healthy for his age just hours earlier, was suddenly struck by excruciating stomach pains, vomiting, and violent diarrhea. Within minutes, the strong farmer who had weathered decades of hardship was reduced to writhing agony in his own home. Velma, as always, played her part perfectly. She called the doctor, stayed at his bedside, brewed healing teas, and prepared comforting broths. To the outside world, she looked like an angel refusing to leave a suffering man's side. But we by now recognize the mask. Family physician Dr. Marcus Webb did his best fluids medication hospital care, but nothing slowed the rapid decline. Within 48 hours, John Henry was gone. Officially, the cause of death was acute gastroenteritis. Reasonable, plausible, believable. But the truth was far more sinister. John Henry had recently started asking pointed questions about missing funds, suspicious transactions, discrepancies he couldn't explain. Velma couldn't allow suspicion to grow. So, she silenced him forever. To the Lee family, Velma was again the picture of devotion helping arrange the funeral offering, record comfort through her grief. But to us, the pattern is undeniable every time someone got too close to the truth Velma struck. Viewers, let me ask you this. If someone like Velma entered your home smiling, praying, pretending to care, would you recognize the danger before it was too late? And stay with me because this story is far from over. Velma's dark path is about to claim even more lives. By now, the pattern should have been clear. But in small-town North Carolina during the 1970s, the idea that a kindly church-going grandmother might secretly be a cold-blooded poisoner was unthinkable. Each death looked like a sad but natural event, never part of a sinister chain. Velma had refined her methods so carefully, dosing arsenic with precision timing symptoms, to appear natural and always wrapping herself in the image of a devoted Christian caregiver, that she was operating in plain sight and no one suspected a thing. But by late 1977, Velma's life took a surprising turn. She entered into a relationship that would prove to be both her most significant and her undoing. His name was Stuart Taylor, a 56-year-old tobacco farmer and widower. Stuart was not like Velma's previous targets. He wasn't frail, confused, or wealthy enough to be worth killing for money. Instead, Stuart was steady, respected, and still in good health. A man of simple habits, devoted to his land, still mourning his wife of over 30 years. Introduced through mutual acquaintances who praised Velma's character, Stuart saw in her what he thought was stability. She cooked, kept his home spotless, and carried herself with the moral dignity that appealed to a man raised on old-fashioned values. For the first time, Velma wasn't just a caregiver, she was a partner filling the loneliness left behind by Stuart's late wife. To the community, they seemed like the perfect couple. To Velma, the relationship offered more than companionship. It gave her respectability, a shield against the whispers that might have arisen after so many coincidental deaths around her. But underneath the veneer of domestic calm, her old demons clawed their way back. Velma's prescription drug addiction had grown so severe that maintaining her habit required enormous sums of money, far beyond what her modest wages could cover. And so the forgeries began again. Stuart's bank accounts became her new lifeline. At first, she was careful. She mimicked his handwriting, perfectly memorized account numbers, and forged checks in amounts just small enough to avoid suspicion. When Stuart occasionally questioned her about the missing money, Velma would cry, feign hurt, and insist it was all for household expenses. Stuart, a trusting man, let it go. But by January 1978, cracks began to show. Stuart's longtime banker, Harold Patterson, noticed unusual spending patterns. Knowing Stuart's frugal habits, Patterson casually mentioned the activity during a chat at the local feed store. Stuart, bewildered, denied making any such withdrawals. The seed of suspicion had been planted. That very evening, Stewart confronted Velma with proof statements and forged checks Patterson had helped him identify. Their argument exploded into fury. Stewart accused her of betrayal, demanded the truth, and threatened to go to the police. In his anger, he shook her shoulders, a brief, frustrated gesture from a man whose trust had been shattered. But for Velma, it was enough. A line had been crossed. In her world, anyone who threatened her secrets, whether a patient, a family member, or now a lover, had only one fate. And Velma had the perfect method to make sure Stewart Taylor would never expose her. So here's the chilling question, friends. Was Stewart the first man sharp enough to uncover Velma's lies? And could he have been the one to finally stop her? Or had he unknowingly signed his own death sentence the moment he confronted her? Stay with me, because this is where Velma's story begins to unravel. That evening, despite their heated confrontation just hours earlier, Stewart and Velma walked into the Cumberland County Civic Center arm in arm. The occasion, a Pentecostal revival service featuring the famous preacher Rex Humbard. To those around them, they looked like any other couple in their Sunday best, perhaps a little quieter than usual, but nothing out of place in the solemn atmosphere of a revival. But beneath the polished surface, something sinister was already at work. Not long after the service began, Stewart started to feel a creeping wave of nausea. At first, he brushed it off, maybe just nerves from their argument. But within minutes, the discomfort sharpened into stabbing stomach pains that forced him from his seat. Velma, ever the picture of a devoted partner, followed him immediately. She fussed over him, offered to drive him home, even earned sympathetic glances from fellow churchgoers who admired her apparent concern. What no one could see, of course, was that this was all part of Velma's deadly script. The ride home was torture for Stewart. His body doubled over in spasms of pain, his breathing labored, his strength draining with every passing mile. Over the next 3 days, he suffered waves of agony, violent vomiting, unrelenting cramps, chest pain that hinted at deeper organ damage. Through it all, Velma never left his side. She brewed teas, served broths, adjusted pillows, and whispered words of comfort. To friends and neighbors, she was the very image of compassion. To Stewart, she was the only lifeline he thought he could trust. But the truth, she was the one tightening the noose. By February 3rd, 1978, Stewart's body could no longer fight. Despite doctors' efforts, his organs shut down one by one, and he died in Cape Fear Valley Hospital with Velma holding vigil at his bedside. His death certificate read the same as so many before complications from acute gastroenteritis. Another tragic but seemingly natural loss. Only this time, the story didn't end there. Unlike Velma's elderly victims, Stewart Taylor was just 56 healthy strong, and with every reason to live. His sudden decline raised immediate suspicions within his family, especially given what Stewart had recently uncovered about Velma's financial deceptions. They demanded a full autopsy, refusing to let his death be dismissed as just one of those things. And then something happened that shattered Velma's carefully woven mask. Her own sister, long troubled by the string of tragedies surrounding Velma, picked up the phone. In a tearful confession to Lumberton police, she admitted what she feared in her heart, that Velma Barfield had poisoned Stewart Taylor, and maybe many others. It was a moment of unbearable tension. One sister torn apart by loyalty, and conscience finally breaking the silence that had allowed a killer to thrive. When the toxicology report came back, it confirmed the unthinkable lethal levels of arsenic coursing through Stewart's system. The kindly churchwoman who had fooled friends, family, and doctors alike was unmasked at last. Velma Barfield, the grandmotherly caregiver, the devout churchgoer, was about to be revealed as one of America's most chilling serial killers hiding in plain sight. Friends, can you imagine that moment? A community realizing that the woman they trusted most had been the one delivering death in a teacup. Stay with me, because what comes next is the shocking aftermath of her arrest and how the truth shook North Carolina to its core. The arrest of Velma Barfield on March 28, 1978, sent shockwaves through the tight-knit communities of Cumberland and Robeson counties. For nearly a decade, she had worn the mask of a grieving widow, a devoted daughter, and a doting grandmother. But now, she was exposed as something else entirely, a calculating serial killer who used arsenic-laced rat poison to eliminate anyone who threatened her secrets. At first, Velma tried to maintain her composure, but under interrogation by veteran investigators from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the facade finally cracked. Faced with undeniable toxicology reports and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, she began to talk, and what she said chilled even the most hardened detectives. Velma confessed to poisoning Stuart Taylor, her own mother, Lillian Bullard, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee. Her tone was flat, almost clinical, as she described how she measured out the doses, timed each administration, and carefully monitored the agonizing symptoms. She claimed incredibly that she had never meant to kill anyone, only to make them sick long enough to cover up her forged checks and buy herself time. Each death, she insisted, was an accident. But investigators weren't buying it. The pattern was far too deliberate. Theft followed by sudden illness. Carefully prepared meals and drinks, followed by mysterious collapse. And always Velma at the center of the storm. The investigation widened. Bodies were exhumed, including that of Jennings Barfield, her second husband who had died back in 1971. Tests revealed significant levels of arsenic, confirming suspicions. Still, Velma denied killing Jennings, and she flatly rejected any suggestion that she had murdered her first husband, Thomas Burke, in the suspicious house fire of 1969. The case was a media sensation. Reporters struggled to reconcile the image of the soft-spoken church-going grandmother with the cold precision of a serial poisoner. National headlines called her the Death Row Granny and the Arsenic Widow. On November 27, 1978, Velma Barfield went on trial in Bladen County Superior Court after a change of venue due to the publicity. Judge Henry A. McKinnon, a veteran of capital cases, presided. District Attorney Joe Freeman. Britt, known as one of the toughest prosecutors in the country, laid out a devastating case. He meticulously traced the trail of forged checks, arsenic poisonings, and suspicious deaths from the fire that killed Thomas Burke in 1969 to Stuart Taylor's agonizing death in 1978. Witness after witness described Velma's unusual behavior during her victims' illnesses, how she insisted on preparing their food and drinks, how she monitored their symptoms with unsettling interest, and how she seemed almost eager to brief doctors and relatives on their conditions. For the defense attorneys, Robert Jacobson and Richard Burr faced a nearly impossible task. They leaned heavily on Velma's drug addiction, painting her as a woman driven by desperation and dulled judgment rather than by malice. But with the physical evidence, her own recorded confessions, and the testimony of grieving families, the tide was against them from the very start. Velma Barfield, the kindly grandmother who hid poison in her kitchen, was now fully revealed before the world. Velma's defense attorneys faced an impossible challenge. They argued that her years of prescription drug abuse had clouded her judgment, that she was too intoxicated to form the intent required for first-degree murder. They spoke of her difficult childhood, even alleging abuse, hoping to stir sympathy in the jury's hearts. The centerpiece of their case came from psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, who claimed Velma suffered from dissociative identity disorder. Lewis even testified that she had spoken with an alternate personality named Billy, the one she said who had committed the murders. But Judge Henry McKinnon wasn't convinced. He cut through the fog with a line that would become famous. One of them did it. I don't care which one. To the court, what mattered was not theory, but the cold reality of Velma's actions. The jury didn't take long. After less than an hour of deliberation, they returned with a verdict guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Stuart Taylor, and then came the sentencing. The prosecution pressed for death, citing 3 aggravating factors: murder for financial gain, murder to obstruct justice, and murder that was, in their words, especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The defense begged for mercy. They pointed to Velma's drug addiction, her troubled past, her role as a mother and grandmother. But it wasn't enough. The jury weighed both sides and decided that the aggravating outweighed the mitigating. On December 2, 1978, Judge McKinnon sentenced Velma Barfield to death by asphyxiation in North Carolina's gas chamber. For 6 long years, Velma's case wound its way through the appeal system. Claims of ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, constitutional violations, all were raised and all were denied. And then, something unexpected happened. On death row, Velma appeared to undergo a profound religious conversion. She led Bible studies, counseled inmates, and began corresponding with prominent Christian leaders. Even Billy and Ruth Graham spoke out on her behalf, urging clemency. The campaign to spare her life grew. Letters poured in from across the world. Supporters insisted her transformation was real, that executing her would serve no purpose. But the families of her victims remained resolute. Justice required her death. Governor Jim Hunt weighed the pleas and, in the end, refused to intervene. In a final act of acceptance, Velma told her lawyers to abandon their last appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. She would face her fate with dignity. At 2:15 a.m. on November 2, 1984, Margie Velma Barfield became the first woman in U.S. history executed by lethal injection. She was also the first woman executed in America since 1962 and the first in North Carolina since 1944. Her final words were simple, almost haunting in their brevity. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain. All the families connected, I am sorry. And I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me all these 6 years. Her last meal, cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. Oddly childlike, almost innocent, a strange contrast to the deadly precision with which she had ended so many lives. Velma Barfield was laid to rest in a quiet, rural cemetery beside her first husband, Thomas Burke, the man whose death in 1969 may have been the spark that began her 15-year killing spree. But her story didn't end with her burial. Velma's case forced law enforcement and medical examiners to rethink how they handled unexplained deaths, especially among the elderly. It exposed flaws in toxicology practices, gaps in oversight, and society's dangerous reluctance to suspect foul play from people who looked trustworthy. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: investigators believed Velma may have had more victims hidden forever by cremation burial or time itself. The true scope of her crimes may never be known, and that leaves us with a chilling reminder: the most dangerous predators often wear the masks of respectability. The caring grandmother, the devoted daughter, the friendly neighbor. So what do you think? Was everything about Velma Barfield truly uncovered, or could there be other victims forever lost to history? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories where history and horror intertwine, don't forget to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this tale with a fellow mystery lover. Because the shadows of the past still have secrets to tell. And here at Sleepy History Tales, we'll be here to whisper them to you.